Lakeview and to the middle of our series on Lamentations. Everything is terrible. You're lucky you came this week because we're going to talk about Lamentations 3. And in the middle of Lamentations 3 is just a little breath of hope. It's sort of like the weather this week. You know, we had lots of minus 40 temperatures leading up to this week. And then when I was sitting prepping my sermon, I had the window open a little bit and it smelled like spring. And it felt like spring, but we know that it's not spring and that there are going to be more minus 40 temperatures and a lot of snow to come. That's a little bit like Lamentations 3. Now, Lamentations was written around 586 BC. This was the destruction of Jerusalem. So the destruction of Jerusalem started out with all of the people being besieged within the walls of the city by the Babylonians outside of the walls. And for 18 months, they were stuck in the city walls and all kinds of terrible stuff happened in there. And then after 18 months, the Babylonians finally made it into the city. They razed it. They destroyed the temple, and they took everybody off into captivity. And what results is this hymn book, or this poetry book of lament called Lamentations. Joe told us in the first week of our series that this is written in a midrashic way, which means that there's not really a lesson that's being taught here. There's not really a place that we land or a truth that we come out with. Instead, what we have is this layering of voices of different people witnessing this catastrophic event and then telling us their point of view. So in the first two chapters, we had a woman speaking in first person and in third person. And the effect that that had was sort of this wide-angled lens, and then we had this up-close view, and then another wide-angled lens, and then another close-up view. And now in chapter 3, the voice changes, and it's a man with a front row seat to the suffering. He's every man. He's one of the people of Jerusalem. But again, we have this first-person, third-person thing going on, this wide-angle lens and up-close view. And what this serves to do is kind of welcome us into the middle of the poetry, to welcome us in to lament. Here in the midst of these voices, though, one is very noticeably absent, and that is the voice of God. And so we have this paradox because we're invited into this community of lamenters, but the one voice that we long to hear is silent. And it reminds us that we don't come to the book of Lamentations to find answers. Instead, we come to find cohorts. There are no answers. In fact, there's kind of this oscillating, like bipolar nature of suffering that's displayed. And if you've ever walked through grief or suffering, or if you've ever walked with someone through grief or suffering, you know that it's kind of like being in a pinball machine. You're like the ball in a pinball machine. You're shot one direction, and then all of a sudden you're in another area, and then you're back to the same emotion you started with. And Lamentations reflects this because there's no timeline, there's no logical sequence, especially in chapter 3. Instead, there is this back and forth of grief. And still, there's kind of this reining in of the grief, though, because the poet writes the poetry of Lamentations by following the Hebrew alphabet. He starts with Aleph, and the first line of the poem starts with Aleph, then the second line is the second letter, the third line is the third letter, all the way to Tov, and then he starts over again. The writer of Lamentations lassoes his grief, his suffering, into prayer. And somehow by doing so, he also invites us to lasso our suffering into prayer as we join him in lament. So let's start, Lamentations 3. I am the one who has seen affliction under the rod of God's wrath. He has made me sit in darkness like the dead of long ago. He has walled me in so that I cannot escape. He has put heavy chains on me. Though I call for help, he shuts out my prayer. He has blocked my way with hewn stones. He has made my paths crooked. He is a bear lying in wait for me, a lion in hiding. He led me off my way, and he tore me to pieces. He has made me desolate. He bent his bow and set me as a mark for his arrow. My soul is bereft of peace. I have forgotten what happiness is, and so I say, gone is my glory and all that I had hoped for from the Lord. The beginning of Lamentations 3 is an intro worthy of an AA meeting, when all of this man's identities, all of his accomplishments are subverted by this one catastrophic event. It's actually comparable to these self-presentation formulas that the kings would use in the inscriptions in the ancient Near East times, but they would read more like this: I am Azitawada, the blessed one of Baal, the servant of Baal, whom Awarku, king of the Durunians, made powerful. But instead, we hear the poet in Lamentations say, I am the one who has seen affliction. I am defined by my suffering. I am weak and trapped and in darkness. God hunts me down like a lion. He devours me like a bear. He leaves me in ashes. My happiness is gone. I am done. My life is a complete loss. He is known only as the one who has seen affliction. Hi, my name is Doug, and I'm an alcoholic. Hi, my name is Carol, and my daughter is a drug addict. Hi, my name is Michael, and my wife just left me. Hi, my name is Sue, and I can't get out of bed in the mornings. When our losses become our identity, when all is lost to the suffering that we endure, Lamentations invites us in. He has walled me in so that I cannot escape. He has put heavy chains on me. Though I call and cry for help, he shuts out my prayer. He has blocked my way with hewn stones. He has made my way crooked. Here we hear echoes of the besieging of the walls of Jerusalem. Except now, it's not the Babylonians that are doing the besieging, but God himself. Hewn stone means cut stone. Cut stone that cuts me off. You see, there's a double imprisonment here that the writer is talking about, a double captivity, because every man feels like he is cut off from God. He is hewn in, though, and he can't escape. He's saying, I cannot see you, God, and yet you are inescapable because of your absence in the presence of my suffering. It is the cut stone that cuts me off. A few years ago, I went through a time of really deep depression and grief. And for a little while, I couldn't read, I couldn't watch television, I couldn't listen to CBC on the radio, I couldn't pray. There was nothing that I could find comfort in. All of my old ways of finding solace were lost to me. And so I found myself just laying in bed. And then one day, I came across these verses in Lamentations, and they made sense to me, and I started to pray again. I was invited into Lamentations. My experience forced me into lament because it cut me off from all of those old ways of finding comfort, and so I had to find another way through. Barbara Brown Taylor puts it like this, that in darkness, in suffering, we come face to face with what matters most because it is too dark for most of our usual shallowing distractions to work. During this time, everything lost its meaning because the words that were spoken to me didn't measure up to the thing that I was experiencing, to my real life experience. And so I couldn't listen to words. Words completely lost their meaning. But as I was invited into Lamentations, words having lost their meaning, not being able to speak anything, words started to become new again. It's sort of like when you're in love, right? And you start to listen to the radio and you realize that all of the songs on the radio are about love. Like, yes, Celine, my heart will go on, right? Or when your heart is broken and instead you realize that all of the songs on the radio are about a broken heart. Yes, Keith Urban, tonight I do want to cry. All of these words are filled with new meaning. Lamentations restored the meaning of words to me. It gave order to the chaos within me. You see, Lamentations calls us to embrace an experience for which we have had no words before, something we haven't had to speak before, to enter a place that we haven't entered before. It gives us honest words for a real lived experience. And perhaps for the first time, when we start to suffer, when we start to lament, we are speaking honestly for the first time. Instead of using words to hide behind, when words are stripped of their meaning, we only use words when they actually mean something. We use words to actually just communicate what we feel. I don't know if you've ever heard of the word keening. Keening is a kind of guttural sound that some cultures use when they're going through a time of deep grief, when they've lost someone they love. They're probably the most honest sounds used for an experience that has no words. And they're probably the closest thing that we ever come to when we were a baby and we just cried because we needed our mothers. It's a kind of primal language. And the language of lament, the honesty of lament, is a kind of primal language. It is the land of the keening widow. Perhaps we approach God first in lament as we really are, not as we think he wants us to be, not dressed up in our Sunday best, but honestly, vulnerably, just as we are. Perhaps we learn how to pray. Eugene Peterson puts it this way: primal language, the language of prayer, is forged in the crucible of trouble. Back to Lamentations. The Lord is good to those who wait for him, to the soul that seeks him. We're hearing a little bit of that spring wind, aren't we? It is good that one should wait quietly for the salvation of the Lord. It is good for one to bear the yoke in his youth, to sit alone in silence when the Lord has imposed it. So sometimes in the summer, if my children ask me really, really nicely, I'll play kick the can with them. But I have a strategy for kick the can that I'm going to share with you this morning. My children are not here, so I'm sharing it with you on the basis that nobody will tell them what my strategy is. I'm looking at the youth there, because this saves me a lot of energy when I'm playing kick the can. So if you've never played kick the can before, this is how it works. You have a can in the middle of the yard, and the goal is that all of the people that are hiding in the yard will come and kick the can before the person guarding the can sees them and calls their name. And I'm always the guard because nobody else wants to guard the can. So this is what I do. I hand out a different colored glow stick to each of my children, and they go and hide. And then all I have to do is just stand by the can and wait until they get too impatient and they come out of their hiding spot, and then I see their glow stick and I can call their name. Now, the older boys, they've already caught on to my wily tricks, so they put their glow sticks in their back pockets. But Moshe, my littlest boy, hasn't caught on yet, and he is the most impatient. And so it's always his glow stick that I see first coming out of the darkness. And when I call Moshe, every time he says, "How do you always know it's me?" It's great. It's great. Instead of moving into their territory, I wait for them to come into mine. And maybe this is what God is doing in the silence of Lamentations. Perhaps God's hiddenness, God's silence here, is calling us out of our own hiding. God steps back to make room for us to step forward into a new space, a new land that we probably would have avoided otherwise, into mystery, into that wide space where our beliefs about who God is and our lived experience just won't meet. It is a wide and broad space, but it is a space where there are no words, there is only silence. There are no explanations. It's a holy game of hide and seek, a sacred game of kick the can. In 1 Kings 19, God invites his prophet Elijah to come and meet him on Mount Horeb. And so Elijah goes up onto the mountain and hides in a cave, and he's kind of like a man on a blind date waiting for the woman that he's meeting to come in the front door. He's like, is that her? Is that her? This is what 1 Kings 19 says about it. Now there was a great wind, so strong that it was splitting mountains and breaking rocks in pieces before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind was an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, there was the sound of sheer silence. And when Elijah heard it, he wrapped his face in his coat, and he went out and met God. Will we go out into the silence and meet God? When lament stops, when we stop looking for God in the wind and in the earthquakes and in the fire, then maybe we are open to stepping into silence. We stop speaking our own way out of situations, and instead we wait for God to speak his way out. What's really interesting here is these verses on staying silent. They're found sandwiched between the most hopeful verses in Lamentations. The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. The Lord is my portion, says my soul. Therefore, I will hope in him. For the Lord will not reject forever. Although he causes grief, he will have compassion according to the abundance of his steadfast love. Let's read verses 22 to 24 again. The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. It feels like finally here in Lamentations, this drowning everyman is coming up for a breath. When I was going through that period of depression, sometimes I would send my kids off to school, and then I would grab my coffee and I would go out and sit on this pile of dirt that I have behind my Quonset. It was kind of my Job's ash heap, comparable to my Job's ash heap. And one morning when I was sitting there drinking my coffee, I looked up and I saw a full moon hanging in the sky. It was kind of one of those dark blue morning prairie skies. The sun was coming up behind me. And the leaves were turning on the trees, and the grain was ready almost to be combined, and everything was just beautiful. And lifting my head and looking at that, I remembered that God was bigger, that there was more to life than what I was going through. And for a moment, I felt that I could breathe. Suffering becomes pedagogy. It teaches us a new way to look at things. It opens us to possibility. And this is what I mean. If you weren't drowning, you wouldn't be looking for rescue. If you weren't lost, you wouldn't be scanning the skies for planes. Only felt pain can be wished unfelt. And only when we are in a hopeless place can we look up to find hope from somewhere else. Every man flees into the story of God. He lifts his head long enough to see the bigger picture. Here it says, the steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. If you remember, we just talked about how he says, I am cut off from God, I am hemmed in. The cut stone that cuts me off, well, never ceases, comes from the same Hebrew root that means to not cut off, to not be cut off. The poet is not cut off. Instead, he is transplanted. He is given new context. He is given a larger story. I'm sure you've all experienced before and after moments. These can be good moments in our lives, or they can be really tragic moments. Things like when we get married or have a child, or even when someone that we love dies. It's an event so huge or so traumatic that we see ourselves as one person before and another person after. And maybe the death of something means the beginning of something else. For the Lord will not reject forever. He will have compassion. And so, in the end, maybe there is a beginning. When I look back on that time in my life that was so difficult, I remember feeling like the silence just meant that my life was over, that something was dead and gone. But looking back on it now, I see that it was also the beginning of something new. It was like the Israelites standing at the Red Sea. So if you know the story, you know that they've escaped Egypt, they've come to the Red Sea, and there's no way through. And so when they turn around to see if they can go back the other way, they see that the Egyptian army is coming. They see these clouds of dust. And so they know that they're dead if they go forward, and they're dead if they turn around. It's the end of them. And so they call out to Moses, and Moses says these words, "You have only to keep silent. The Lord will fight for you. Be quiet. Be still. Wait for God." And we know that the end of the story is that God parts the waters and they go through the Red Sea. And instead of being the end of the nation, it is the beginning of a nation as they head into freedom. Barbara Brown Taylor again. Silence is the central place of faith where we give the word back to God from whom we first received it. Surrendering the word, we surrender the medium of our creation. We unsay ourselves, voluntarily returning to the source of our being, where we must trust God to say us once again. In silence, we travel back in time to the day before creation, when all being was a part of God's body. Silence is pregnant with possibility. When we lift our heads, we see that there is a sun and a moon hanging in the very same sky. We see that a new day is coming, and with it, the faithfulness and mercies of God. Another gift of silence is that it enrolls us. It makes us participants in our own lives instead of avoiders. We're so good at avoiding our lives. The silence of God, his restraint to act on our behalf, encourages us to act instead, to step into the space where we'll look anywhere to find out why something is happening to us. We start to ask questions like, did I do something? Why me? What if? If only. The silence makes us uncomfortable enough to be introspective, to reflect, to rummage around inside of ourselves, and to find out if maybe the problem is not so much what is out there, but what is in here. Ian Stackhouse says this about the Israelites. The reason for Judah's suffering, therefore, lies deep in the heart of human beings and not deep in the heart of God. And God is the God who takes such people back. You see, when we realize that the problem is in us, that we cannot save ourselves, we look for outside help. And so we put out the SOS. And here's the writer of Lamentations putting out the SOS. My eyes will flow without ceasing, without respite, until the Lord from heaven looks down and sees. You have taken up my cause, O Lord. You have redeemed my life. You have seen the wrong done to me, O Lord. Judge my cause. You have seen all their malice, all their plots against me. Remember how we talked about grief is like a pinball machine? Well, grief has propelled us from silence back into speech here. And we're not just in speech, we're witness to this eruption. And here we see that the writer of Lamentations has found that he is not self-sufficient. In fact, he is desperate. There's actually good evidence that we could interpret the Hebrew in a different way in this passage, that we could interpret it in the imperative, which is actually a demand. So it would read more like this. My eyes will flow without ceasing, without respite, until the Lord from heaven looks down and sees. Take up my cause. Redeem my life. You have seen the wrong done to me, O Lord. Judge my cause. Every man demands that God act, and his demands are rooted in a denial that God is powerless to do something about his situation. And they're also rooted in the belief that he is powerless to do anything about his situation. He is staking all on God, and he boldly insists that God do his part. So, we're back to minus 40 temperatures, just like I warned you. There was only a breather. There were no answers. But this is how grief works, isn't it? And while this chapter provides us with the most hope in Lamentations, it still ends without us hearing the voice of God. You see that the writer of Lamentations actually ends up no better than he started. And it makes you wonder if closure is just a myth, because his questions remain unanswered. Nicholas Wolterstorff says this about our unanswered questions. Our wounds are unanswered questions. And so if our wounds are unanswered questions, and no questions are answered here at the end of the most hopeful chapter in Lamentations, then what do we say about that? Henry Nouwen says it best. As long as you keep pointing to the specifics, you will miss the full meaning of your pain. You will deceive yourself into believing that if the people, the circumstances, the events had been different, your pain would not exist. And this might be partly true, but the deeper truth is that the situation which brought about your pain was simply the form in which you came in touch with the condition of suffering. Your pain is the concrete way in which you participate in the pain of humanity. Our wounds become the ways in which we live compassionately with one another. Being ushered into this community of people who have questions unanswered, these wounded people, these fellow sufferers, it enrolls us in meaning making. Somehow this brings something out of our pain. It doesn't answer why we suffer. Our questions remain open. But this lack of closure also leaves us open to one another. So now that we're back where we started, what do we do? Well, we have one of two options, as every man has shown us in Lamentations 3. We can either sit in silence and wait for God, or we can speak aloud again our suffering and our despair. But what we must not do, what we must never do, is rush to easy answers or turn away from God. Okay, I have filled this silence long enough, probably too long, and if I continue to do so, I might fill the silence that God wants to fill. Who am I to fill your silences? I can testify, witness to the fact that God has met me in the middle of my silences, and I can tell you and encourage you that with the help of God's people, past and present, and with the words of Lamentations, that you have what you need to suffer. But sometimes there are no words, there is only encounter. And so today, we're going to practice silence. I'm going to leave the stage, and you're just going to sit here, and you're going to try to listen to God. I encourage you to just clear your hearts and your minds and try to hear where God might be hiding. When the silence is over, the band is going to come out and just play quietly, and that's your cue that you're dismissed. You're welcome to go then, or you can stay and listen to God a little while longer. And if you need prayer, someone will be here to the left of the stage to pray with you. It is good to sit alone in silence, for the Lord will not reject forever. Although he causes grief, he will have compassion. May God meet you in this silence and in your silences this week.